Hi, I'm Rob Preston, and William Lowe and I are here to have another roadmap discussion. Tonight, we're going to talk about a few things that we found to be important to us early on in our stroke recovery in terms of walking, both in terms of getting up out of the wheelchair so that you can walk, because unless you can stand up, weight bear, and you have some level of balance, you can't really walk. And also some tips that you can use once you are walking, even with a walking aid, a cane or whatever, that you can use to improve your gait and maybe and eventually shed the cane. But we're not going to particularly talk about canes and walking devices. Uh, so, William, you've got some thoughts on the beginning of this and things you can do in the wheelchair. We both do, and uh, sit stands are important. So, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think that this discussion about the early days of recovery after stroke, it's overlooked because quite often with a lot of stroke survivors who I've spoken to, um, early on in their stroke recovery, they've always said that they didn't get the information which they needed in order to really drive their recovery and see improvements, particularly in the early stages when that neuroplasticity is at its peak. And this actually limits a lot of stroke survivors because further down the line, they find that their brain has developed a lot of bad habits, and it's almost impossible to get back that lost time, which they didn't get the opportunity to access when they should have. So I think in this segment of the roadmap, what we're going to be discussing is something which is extremely important, and that's teaching your brain how to learn how to walk while you're in a wheelchair so that it can develop the habits which it needs in order to progress towards walking walking independently once you leave the hospital or once you've been discharged from insurance. So I think I think the first thing a stroke survivor has to consider or think about when it comes to returning to walking is that when you're in hospital, particularly in those early days, you've got to find every opportunity you can to do some form of exercise to help teach the brain to send those signals through to your legs and those muscles, which it might have forgotten how to after you've had your stroke. So the first thing which which I found beneficial in my recovery was making sure that when I was sitting in a wheelchair that I was doing exercises such as marching on the spot. And the reason why marching is such a great exercise is because it helps strengthen up the muscles, which are extremely important when it comes to walking. And in this case, these are your hip flexors. So your hip flexors are basically the muscles which are used to lift up your affected hip whenever you lift up your affected leg whenever you're walking. And it's great to do these while you're sitting down in a wheelchair because in those early days, it's going to be very difficult to be able to distribute that weight and especially weight bear on your affected leg um, without the risk of your knee hyperextending, given that your knee does not have that control to actually support the weight of your body. So that's the first exercise which I would suggest to do. And and together with that exercise, I would also suggest really teaching your brain how how to stand up properly and distribute weight across both legs correctly. And one way of doing this is doing something which myself and Ralph learned in our recovery, which is called nose over toes. And it's basically a technique which you can use whenever you're standing up to ensure that you're teaching your brain the correct technique such that it's able to remind itself of how it used to distribute weight equally across both legs before you had your stroke. And nose over toes is basically done how it sounds. So you want both of your feet to be parallel and hip width apart while you're sitting down. And once you're in that position, you want to lean over until your nose are completely until your nose are over your toes. And once you're in that position, you want to push through both of your legs slowly until you're standing up. And what this does is this actually teaches your brain how to distribute weight equally across both legs. And why this is so important is because in recovery after stroke, especially in those early days, your brain is going to be very tempted to rely mainly on the non-affected leg to actually do most of the weight bearing. And so if you can get into the zone and get into the habit of teaching your brain the correct way of actually distributing weight across both legs, then you're going to be much better off than if you were to start off and allow your brain to follow its own agenda of what it wants to do, which is basically rely on the good leg for everything rather than giving some attention to the affected leg to actually help in walking. And so those are two important exercises which I recommend every stroke survivor to really keep in mind when it comes to the recovery after stroke. And even though I've 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 had a particular focus on the early days of recovery after stroke, these exercises are relevant no matter how far you are in your recovery after stroke. If you're in a situation, let's say, where it's been 2 or 3 years after your stroke and you find that you're leaning more towards your non-affected leg whenever you're walking in order to use it to stabilize yourself so that you can heave or lift up your affected leg forward, then it might be because you hadn't taught your brain the correct habits of how to distribute that weight equally across both legs. So I think these two exercises are really important, and they also help your brain to be able to teach itself how to actually lead with the affected leg, which is something which is of paramount importance when it comes to recovery after stroke. Because for all you folks who are watching this and listening to this, we all know that your non-affected leg, it's always going to be good. So you don't really have to do therapy for that leg anyway, unless you have another stroke, God forbid. So what you can actually do to actually flip the script and actually allow your brain to actually learn things a lot quicker is to actually remind itself that it can actually lead with the non-affected leg. And what you'll find is that if you can put a lot more focus on leading with your affected leg, that you might find that your walking will improve quite a lot, and you'll find that you'll get into more of a rhythm and that your gait would improve. I mean, that's at least what I found with the clients who I've coached. And I know, Ralph, you and I were having a discussion earlier around this whole idea about leading with the affected leg in recovery after stroke to really get back to walking. And you shared some ideas with me. Just wondering if you could share your thoughts with everyone else who's watching this right now and why it's so important to lead with that affected leg.
Sure. I want to back up for a sec to the wheelchair because there are a couple other things you can do. Part of walking also is going to involve heel strike and push off with your toe. And so one of the things that you can do in a wheelchair is you can do toe raises where you just have your feet flat on the ground, shoulder width apart, and pull them up. I do them, and I recommend people do them bilaterally. That means both at the same time, because your unaffected foot and the unaffected side of your brain will help the affected foot and the affected side of your brain and make it easier. So when you pull up your toes, you're doing basic dorsiflexion. And then you put them back down. If you lift up your heels, you're doing basic plantar flexion. So, and both of those are important in terms of, walking, because walking involves some ankle strength as well as not hyperextending your knee and having upper leg strength so you don't circumduct your leg in a circle, hip flexors so you don't dip your hip when you walk. There are many, many things, but when you're in a wheelchair, you're kind of limited. Of course, if you're there's lots of things that you can do in bed too. We talk about that if we get to it. But as far as leading with your affected leg, yeah, I found that people always lead with their unaffected foot. And I think that's, I'm pretty sure that's because they don't want to weight bear. And so that it's more stable. But it leads to bad habits. That's how people get into a 3-point gait with a cane instead of a 2-point gait, because they lead with one, and then they do the other, and then do the cane, or it's actually cane, one, the other, cane. And so that's one thing. If you can start leading with the affected foot. The other thing I noticed that stroke survivors do when you're first walking is they do what I call, they play catch up with their with the unaffected foot. So they take a big step with the affected foot, and then taking a big step and putting the heel of the unaffected foot opposite the toe, at least, of the affected foot. They do it toe to toe and just basically play catch up. Take a step here, play catch up. So you're not really walking in the sense that you're not making progress with every single step. So one of the things that I've always taught people was to try and take a bigger step with the unaffected foot, because it forces the affected foot and leg to do more weight bearing. And a lot of people can't go all the way to the heel. That would be the goal, or even a little longer, where the heel of your unaffected foot is even with the toe of your affected. So if you can't do that, I teach people to go to the arch of the foot, like halfway, work on that for a little while. I want to circle back on the sit to stands, because one thing I found is, people early on in stroke have a hard time standing up. They aren't talking to their affected leg typically, and their unaffected leg isn't used to doing all of the weight bearing and pushing yet. It'll get used to it over the next couple months, but actually the more you can do with your affected leg, the better. So one of the things you see, okay, do a sit to stand. Well, you go get your nose over your toes and you don't have the power. Now, ultimately, you don't want to pull up or push up, but one thing you do is push up on the wheelchair. I often have used the suction cup grab bar on a counter, and I wheel the wheelchair up and lock it, and they can stand up and they can pull up as much as they need to stand up. Like I said, ultimately you don't want to be pulling up. You want to have your hands across your chest in neutral and just, practice sit stands, put your nose over your toes and just do it. But that doesn't happen in the early months. So one of the things that I've done is use the grab bar, and I try and teach people to think about pushing up with their affected leg. I also try and teach them to push up with their legs as much as they can and pull up as little as possible, and keep shifting that until they can push up with their legs. Also, when you get standing up at the counter with your hand or hands on the grab bar, depending on how many you have use of, you're in a good position to start doing some weight bearing. You can just stand there so you can stand up, stand there for 15 seconds, sit down, stand up again. You can even start some simple weight shifting, because one of the things that you're going to have to do to walk is you're going to have to do a lot of weight bearing. We tell people, I don't know about you, William, but I tell people to do weight bearing, and they think that they're going to do it for a week and that's going to be it. No, it's one of those things that stays for months and months. Because even when you think you're doing it, you're not. I don't know how to explain that, but we've talked about how when you do like a heel raise standing at the counter, you're pushing up with 80-90% with your unaffected leg. Well, the simple way to solve that is do a affected leg only heel raise or knee bend, but people can't do that right out of the gate. So pulling up is a good way to get moving, because even though it's not the desired movement in the end, you're getting somewhere. You're starting to stand and move. A lot of people say, I can't do that yet, and continue to sit in a wheelchair, and that's not good. Well, we have neuroplasticity our whole lives. You do have more closer to the stroke. That's why we've done a talk on the importance of jumping on your recovery, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so, William, I know you got more things to share on this subject, so I've been talking a while. Why don't I toss it back to you?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to add to everything you've mentioned, especially with those sit to stands. And for those of you who are watching, sit to stands is the therapist term which they use to describe your squats. So I just want to add on to that. I think it's really important, especially in those early days in your recovery after stroke, because your brain has a tendency to want to rely on the non-affected leg or the good leg to do everything. That when you're doing these squats or when you're doing these sit to stands, that you're leaning towards your affected leg as you go up and also leaning towards your affected leg when you come down. The reason why this is so important is because you want to really encourage your brain to put an emphasis on relying mainly on the affected leg to take on most of the weight. And you not only just want to do this for the exercise itself, but whenever you go about your day. So when you get out of bed, the very first thing in the morning and you're standing up, you should be doing your nose over toes squat, and you should be leaning towards your affected leg as you go up. Every time you get out of the car, every time you stand up from the toilet. Like, this is a prescription for success. And it's something which you're going to have to constantly police your brain to do. Otherwise, your brain's just going to follow its own agenda, which is relying mainly on the non-affected leg to do everything, which in turn will lead to really bad habits down the track where you might find that they are swaying more towards one side whenever you're walking, or as some stroke survivors describe it, they feel like they're walking as if they're drunk. And just to add on to that point, with emphasizing the use of the affected leg, I think that this is also really important when it comes to taking those steps, as Ralph had mentioned. So if you can lead with your affected leg whenever you walk, you'll find that it actually is a lot easier to actually bend your affected leg when you lead with it first, and rather than your non-affected leg. And what this will do in turn, when you lead with your affected leg and you actually teach your brain how to bend your affected leg first, this can actually help you address the problem of your knee hyperextending whenever you're walking. Because the main reason why your knee hyperextends in the first place is because you just don't have that control in your knee, and you also don't have strong enough hamstrings which are able to relax at the same time when you're actually taking your step as well. So if you can lead with the affected leg, and you can really teach the brain to emphasize to put more weight on the affected leg whenever you're walking, not just when you're doing your exercises, but every single hour of your day, whenever you're doing mundane tasks such as, standing up from the toilet, standing up from your bed when you get up in the morning, and ingrain that as a habit, then the byproduct of all of these small habits is being able to walk more efficiently and being able to get into more of a rhythm whenever you walk. And I think that's just something which is worth mentioning, because the number one problem and the number one challenge I hear from a lot of stroke survivors who I've exchanged notes with over the years is that they find that whenever they're walking, they can't get into a rhythm, or they find that their knee keeps hyperextending. And this in turn leads to, the risk of falling, not being able to be independent when they're walking outside, particularly down a sloped driveway, or just a feeling of shame when they're walking around the supermarket and having people look at them and thinking that something's wrong with them, and getting that unwanted attention which they don't necessarily need because of because of the way that they walk. So it all really comes down to those habits and really teaching your brain to put more emphasis and attention on the affected leg through some of these exercises which we've described here today, um, so that your brain can connect those dots and recover what was lost. So that's pretty much everything I have to cover. Or things I want to add. But as good as these exercises are, they can only get you so far in your recovery after stroke. And at some point, you're going to have to teach your brain how to apply some of the things it's already learned so that you can progress in your recovery after stroke and see more changes and improvements in your walking. And that's where better exercises such as bridges actually come into play. And the reason why bridges are so good is because just like with your squats, where you were teaching your brain how to distribute weight equally across both legs, doing exercises such as bridges while lying down in bed or while lying down on the floor, this allows your brain to train up those muscles in a different way and also give your brain a different experience of what it feels to apply whatever it's already learned so that it can strengthen what it's already got and improve its ability to walk in your recovery after stroke. Now early on, Ralph, you and I, we were having a discussion about some of these exercises. I was just wondering if you wanted to share anything or share your thoughts on some of these things which I've mentioned, because I've been talking for a while now, and I'll just throw it back to you.
Sure. Well, one thing you can do to facilitate that you are pushing up with both legs when you do a bridge is you can put a ball, something about that big. I did a video where I used a bike helmet because I didn't have a ball. And I also rolled up a beach towel. I folded it in thirds instead of halves, so it was about that big and fat, and I put that between my knees. When you have something and you press in, then it makes sure that it forces you to push up fairly evenly with both legs. This is another. The other thing I found was that when you lead with the affected foot, when you, they'll teach you. I did it both in walking and going up the stairs. And if you think about it, if you're leading with your unaffected, you're leaving that one behind in terms of hyperextension. When you lead with it's bent. You're not leaving it behind. Think about the steps, because when you go up with your unaffected foot first, they have you leave the affected foot behind. Well, it's in a perfect position for your knee to lock, and so. Listen to your therapist, but as soon as you get strong enough, you can start trying to lead with your affected foot and go up steps leading with your affected foot. Then what I did was eventually I practiced like not thinking about it, going up with either, and starting off with either. But starting off with the affected foot and then paying attention to the unaffected foot, not playing catch up, moving it ahead, that takes a little while. Those are both good things to be doing. So ultimately, you want your gait to be even, whatever it is. You want to put each foot the same amount each time. So that's all I've got on this. I mean, we could talk about walking better for about a month, but this covered some of the basics, particularly in the early days. And I would say, put in your time. If you want to get out of the wheelchair, put in your time. Stay in the bed and do bed exercises. If they got you in a wheelchair, learn things you can do in the wheelchair. This is another thing, but there's certain core exercises you can do in the chair. And we've talked about core. Core is key. So the only way people get better is to move and build up muscles and build up connections. So that's what you want to be doing. So, William, you have anything else?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, I just wanted to add on to that. So for all of you watching, you might notice that the reoccurring theme here is building up those small habits, so that later on in your recovery, you can actually see see all of your effort and all of the work you put in pay off. Because when you really emphasize to your brain that it needs to pay more attention to the affected leg through exercises, through the small things you're doing throughout the day, standing up from the bed, making sure that you're leaning towards your affected leg, and from the toilet, so on and so forth. That's that you're going to be constantly reminding your brain, and you're also going to be applying some of the things that your brain has already learned to strengthen up those connections after you've had your stroke. Because if you just because there's no such thing as set it and forget it in recovery after stroke. You can't just do one exercise one time and then you're going to wake up the next morning and you're going to be able to walk again. But rather returning to walking, it's a long process. And if you don't allow your brain to do it correctly, then your brain's just going to use the non-affected leg all the time, and it's going to take the easy way out. So you can see in this discussion with Ralph and myself, we've really advocated for really paying more attention to your affected leg, making the most of your situation, especially in hospital when you're stuck in a wheelchair and you've got nothing to do, or when you're lying down in bed, you've got nothing to do, and you want to move the needle in your recovery. We've shared some exercises which you can do to actually get the ball rolling in those early days of recovery after stroke, especially because that's when neuroplasticity is at its peak, and that's when your brain is going to be most receptive to learning, and that's where most stroke survivors, at least 90% of stroke survivors, say they get most of their improvements.
Good point. So I have some videos of some of the exercises we talked about, and I'll put them in the description below this video. And the reason for the importance of what William just went over is that we're trying to teach people that, well, bad habits are hard to break. So the more you can get off to a good start and learn good habits, the better off you're going to be, because it's a lot easier process to learn things right. Sometimes you don't have the strength and whatever, so we have to sometimes accept things that aren't perfect in the interim, but you always want to work them out and work towards form, um, because learning how to undoing bad habits is really a hard process. And I know because I made a couple of mistakes in my recovery and had to unlearn some things. So that's it for this week, and we will see you again soon when we have another roadmap discussion. Thank you, William.
Yeah, yeah, no problem, Ralph. Great to be here.